Welcome again to the series that we've been doing around tactical and practical effective things that we can do to manage our individual and collective responses to COVID-19. It's definitely a period of very unusual activity across the globe. I was saying to somebody recently, it's probably the first time in living memory, really, where we have had a genuinely global impact on literally everybody from one event, and that's quite something to be in the midst of that. And our experience of it individually is very different from people who are at the dire end of the medical side of this, actually getting ill and dying, and some people whose businesses have completely dried up and disappeared, others whose businesses are actually going faster and more ferociously than they ever had before. It's a really diverse set of experiences. So the intent of this is to give people some useful tactical strategic tools that they can use day to day in managing themselves, their families and their businesses through this period of time. And particularly over the last couple of weeks, we've been looking at what can we do to start to set us up for success, both in terms of enduring the long phase of when will it end, now that we're out of some of those initial acute decisions around how do we actually navigate the first part, but also what do we do about some of the opportunities that present themselves, some of the things that we're learning, etc. And today's session will speak specifically to that topic of recovery and reimagining an alternate future, I guess, and what that looks like. What I'd like to do to start with is just share with you a short video clip. So this woman, Dr. Joanne D'Alcoeta, is a sports psychologist, and she's talking here about athletes doing visual rehearsal for their events, which at face value has got nothing at all to do with what we're discussing. But I think there's some really useful insights into the process of thinking your way through scenarios and making the most of the various possibilities that might present themselves. It goes for about 1:30, and we'll use that as a bit of a springboard into today's session. So here we go with Dr. Joanne D'Alcoeta.
The top three mistakes that I think athletes make are, number one, visualizing the perfect scenario and only seeing the perfect race, the perfect event, the perfect outcome. And that's important to do, but if you only do that, then you're caught off guard if something else happens. So what you need to do instead is, what I teach my athletes is to visualize all the different scenarios that could happen and then have a plan for getting through each one successfully. So I work on visualizing, coming from behind, being in front, being neck and neck with someone, visualize the weather not going right, visualize all the different possible things that could come up, and then see yourself having a plan for each one of those. Most of us only have a plan A, but we want to have a plan B. And the second mistake that athletes make, I feel, is seeing the mistakes in their minds, going over and over the mess-ups. And as soon as we make a mistake, of course, we visualize that and the body follows those mental instructions. So I teach people to be able to be like a film director. If you see that mistake in your mind, you can say, cut, go back, visualize it exactly how you want, and keep visualizing it so you get the perfect picture in your mind. And then the third mistake that people make, I think, is getting too hyped up, not finding that right energy level before their event. They get too hyped up or they get too relaxed, and so they aren't able to, really perform at their best. So you need to find that right energy level for you.
So I think all three of those mistakes could equally apply in this situation. And the topic that we'll be talking with Stephen Young today about, sorry, YouTube is just playing itself to me in the background, very distracting. the topic we'll be talking to Stephen Young about today is recovery specifically from crises. And Stephen's a small business owner like myself, but most of his work has been in extensive recovery from some fairly large scale events and working with organisations, larger organisations, to build their organisational resilience. So much of what he's going to be talking about will have that flavour to it, but it applies really equally to whether we're thinking about ourselves as an individual, whether we're thinking about our family unit, or whether we're in charge of a team or an organisation. I think we introduced Stephen fairly comprehensively last time he was on this session, a couple of weeks ago, but a couple of pieces that are particularly pertinent to today's session. Stephen was actually in charge of the 2006 response and recovery to Cyclone Larry in Queensland. At that stage, that was the largest recovery from a natural disaster in Australia. There have been larger responses since, but that was the biggest one at the time. And it was so significant that they were pretty much writing the book about recovery as they went. So Stephen's a genuine thought leader in this space. He's done a lot of deep work, sometimes literally having to make this stuff up on the fly so that it works for the long haul. And many of the principles of what they developed during that time and applied have become essentially the gold standard for how you do this stuff. Stephen, it's great to have you here again. Thank you very much for making your time available to us. I'm particularly curious at the moment because this is one of those things where the end point is unknown. And a bit like the start point, it's probably going to vary a bit depending on the kind of organisation you are and what the impact has been and what opportunities present themselves as a result of this to you. What can people start doing now to be planning and preparing for recovery at whatever point in time that becomes something they can focus on?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Thanks again for the opportunity. Look, probably a couple of things to kick off with. People should understand that recovery is really difficult. And I think the challenge that we all will face with this is that we will be exhausted by the crisis. And then we'll need to get our recovery stuff happening. And I think that certainly in the cyclone, if I think about Cyclone Larry, you mentioned that earlier, we were still trying to recover the community a year after the cyclone had hit, and it wasn't because we lacked resources. There's just so much to do. And we'll talk a bit about that today. And one of the things from a personal perspective, I was exhausted from the 24/7 response and relief activity, and then thrown straight into the recovery bit. And then I worked in Innisfail with General Cosgrove for 6 months. Almost under the same pressure in recovery as we were in response. And I think that was one of the big lessons for me, is that the people think that, okay, it's time to recover. Everything's going to get great. No, recovery is way more complicated. So that's probably one that I'd like to kick off with. The second one, I'm not a real buzzword guy, but I like people to think about bouncing forward, not bouncing back. And I think that's a really important thing. If you get your recovery right, you should be able to bounce forward as an organisation more resilient than what you were prior to the crisis. And that's not always the case, but I guess if you follow some key principles that we'll talk about, then I think that will go a long way. So some of the things that I think that are important for people to note, and like last week, I'll make up a bit of a handout for this and send it out so people don't stress if you don't get the notes or don't get it all down. One size doesn't fit all. So a one size methodology doesn't fit every organisation, small, large. One size doesn't fit every family because everybody has different needs, different situations. So understanding it, the notion around one size fits all, having a plan, and we're going to implement the plan, and everybody's going to get the plan, is doomed to failure. And that was one of the really strong lessons out of Larry, for sure. In this one of the first things is context. So what's the context in which we're recovering? You made a point earlier that this affects everybody. I can't think of a sector that's not affected by this. Some are benefiting, like Zoom, I guess. Their share price is probably better than Virgin's. So there are some sectors that have benefited, others are decimated. The context around this is that everybody will be fatigued. No one's been spared. And this is going to take a long time to recover, because whilst we may well be ready to recover personally or as an organisation or a small business, those around you may not be ready to recover. So the kind of notion that, oh, it's all over, social isolation is finished, let's get into recovery. Well, that may be okay for some, but it may not be okay for others. And trying to imagine what that looks like will be a bit of a challenge. Recognising complexity. So that's a really important one also, is understanding that typically recovery solutions are really complicated because they're multifaceted. And the other element is that everybody recovers at different speeds. So if you're running an organisation, some people within the organisation will be ready to recover the minute you turn the switch on, and others will take time. So again, that kind of fits a bit into that one size fits all. Having a clear understanding of what your community is, and in the kind of emergency management world, they talk about a community-led approach, and that was one of the things we found at Larry was really important, is getting the community having a sense that they own the recovery. And I guess if we think about it from an organisation's perspective, having your internal and external community having an ownership share in the recovery process is pretty important as well. Coordinating, I talked about...
Can I pause you there for a sec, Steve? I think there's an important transition point in there, isn't there? Because often in the crisis phase, and I've spoken to a lot of leaders about this, there's the need to be quite directive, quite command and control, quite, decisive. Let's just smack through the decisions and get this done. And at some point, there's got to be a conscious rolling back of that, and more. Okay, now it's all we, but the focus needs to shift, as you say, to the community leading that more.
Yeah, it's a really, really good point. I'm glad you made a point there. That was one of the lessons I learned the hard way, is that I went bull of the gate. My mind was still in response relief phase, and I went bull of the gate and got pushback and said, hang on a minute, this is about us, not about you. And then it was a bit of a lesson to me that maybe I should be listening more to what the community is saying about recovery and what I think about recovery. And there's a balancing act there about what needs to happen from an organisational perspective, but what your community, your internal, external community can cope with. So there's a real fine balance there. I talked a couple of weeks ago about the need to coordinate decisions, and I think that the coordination of recovery is one of the key elements, and that's what makes it so complicated. Is that that some of the cases in Larry, we had local, state, and federal government agencies involved in fixing the one problem, and you imagine that in peacetime there'd be 50 committees set up, and we'd have all sorts of sort of governance arrangements around that, and that necessarily isn't going to be the case in recovery. So figuring out how we coordinate that across our networks really important. Communication is key, and I would use the same model we talked about. Tell people this is what we know about recovery, this is what we don't know about recovery, this is what we're doing, and this is what I need you to do. I think is a really stellar way to deal with that. And then the final bit about that is what capacity can we build into our recovery? So how do we bounce forward? How do we become a better organisation as a result of this this kind of recovery thing that we're kind of going into? And I think that from an organisational perspective, and certainly this is what I've recommended to the organisations I've been talking to, is that you should be having those conversations now. And if you're not having those conversations, you should start to have those conversations. I'm just looking at a comment there. I can't quite read it, but your team meetings, if it's a crisis team or the family team or whatever, your small business team, the questions probably that spring to mind immediately are, what are some of the risks and challenges we might face in recovery? And that may well be that some of our supply chains no longer there or doesn't exist. Some of our clients may not get back, so we might lose that market share. So we might not be able to recover as quickly as we can. And then the final question I'd ask would be, what are we doing now to recover? We don't know when, but what are we doing now to recover? And some of the ways we could think about that last question would be to do some scenario planning. Is that if this lasts for 3 weeks, so, Prime Minister said that another 4 weeks of isolation. It looks like Singapore's released the restrictions and they've had a second wave. So that could be the same as us. So, so we, in my mind, I'm scenario planning. If we can get back to work in 4 weeks' time, what does that look like? What does that look like in my in my calendar with my clients? So I'd be thinking about that, and also probably worst case scenarios. If we're still locked down at Christmas, what's that look like? And to me, that would be the worst possible case scenario for our economy. So I guess a couple of those sort of key questions around doing some basic scenario planning. And I think if we talk about an organisational context, this is certainly what I've recommended to my clients, is that the last question on your team meeting is, what are we doing about recovery? So I would want my team to go away thinking about recovery, because we're consumed with response and putting out bushfires everywhere. But that's gonna ease, and we'll have to recovery. And one of the things that is pretty typical is organisations typically blunder their way out of a crisis and then think about recovery. And we know that if you think about recovery early in the piece and start putting some structure around that, then you will bounce forward as much as you possibly can. So I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, that's great, Steve. And I think the tips that Dalco Etta was giving in that short video clip about imagining multiple possibilities. For me, the key to that is doing that fairly lightly, so that you're not locking yourself into any one of those. And you're not also creating yourself an extra layer of angst and worry about, what if? But you're giving yourself that kind of agility to go, okay, if it looks like this, here is some of what we could do that's positive and proactive.
On that, Mike, just I'm a bit of a firm believer in not worst case scenario, but worst likely scenario. So, worst case scenario is we're locked down for the next 2 years. Well, that's probably not likely.
Yes.
So I think worst likely scenario is probably, maybe June 30 or something like that. In June, we're still in lockdown. But so thinking about it in a kind of pragmatic way, I think is important.
Yeah, absolutely. Get an edge of realism into it. So I've been talking to a couple of leaders over the last probably week in particular about they're finding that tension that you often hear crisis management specialists talk about, which is, you get stood up into the role of dealing with the crisis, and meanwhile your day job doesn't go away. You've still got functions to fulfill, and often they're quite core to the business, and especially for those businesses that have still got some level of operational reality moving for them. They're not in just total standstill right now. How do you balance that process of the complexity of emerging out of crisis, transitioning out of the acute phase into recovery, and holding that alongside your critical core functions that kind of need to do anyway? It's a lot to juggle.
Well, for people like you and I, pretty difficult to you just got to move. You know, if you're a small business, you've got to be doing the day-to-day plus the recovery. So you don't have. But for organisations, my thoughts are that as the weeks pass by, we should be thinking about we're getting closer to recovery. So my thoughts are that you would almost convert your crisis team into a recovery team, and it should be multidisciplinary. So different parts of the organisation should be represented on that, because every part of the organisation is going to be critical to recovery, and different parts will recover at different speeds. So that to me makes an important thing. But certainly I talked earlier about fatigue. The organisation will be exhausted by this. My wife is working from home, and she's finding it way more difficult working from home, trying to do her job. And I've got clients that have got young children, and they're doing their work at night because they're teaching their kids during the day. So asking that person to jump in now and focus full-time on recovery and do their job is going to be a real challenge. And I think that's a really big issue that organisations need to do. And I think that a team-based approach is the only way that you can do it. But there's no escaping the fact that the recovery to this is going to be long and it's going to be difficult. And I don't mean to sound like a doomsday prophet, but having a team-based approach with the endorsement of the executive, I think is critical, because you'll need to, and that was, to be perfectly honest, General Cosgrove had the support of Prime Minister John Howard and Premier Beattie during Larry. So when we couldn't get something done, he would ring the Prime Minister, and immediately I would get a secretary from Australian government department ring me up saying, "What do you need done?" So having that endorsement at a strategic level to get stuff done in recovery is critical, because you will butt up against really difficult, complex problems that you need to be super creative about. So I don't have any really great kind of ideas about that, other than it's going to be hard. But remember though that probably parts of your business as usual won't be business as usual.
Yeah,
it'll be business as new. Your new normal or your new usual. That we'll have to kind of morph into ourselves in a way. So it may not look like it did, and I suspect that's going to be a big thing, is that business in the future is not going to look like it did in 2019.
I think there's also a risk there of bringing pressure into the situation by nature of how rapidly we've been able to do some things in this sort of last 3 to 6 weeks. I was talking to somebody from a global company day before, who they run an IT function in that company and across several offices around the globe, and they've gone full remote, and they've had to set their company up for that. That involved pressing the button on a project that they were going to do anyway, but they were anticipating it would take 2 years, and they took 3 days. And she said, there's all sorts of gaping holes in that, because we took 3 days, but effectively we got it done. The part of the risk, I think, is that we could potentially come out of this and put pressure on ourselves by saying, well, look, we got all that stuff done in super quick timeframes back there. Yep. How come we can't smash it out at the same kind of rate?
Yeah. Yep.
And if we add that to the fatigue and complexity that we'll get coming out, I don't think that will help. It'll just compound the scenario.
And you said earlier, Mike, which is an important point to probably bring in there to add to that, is that a kind of a authoritarian approach to recoveries not going to cut it. It has to be a super empathic kind of approach. So I think a change in leadership from the kind of can do, get it done kind of style in recovery is won't help that already fatigued business.
Yeah. So I guess a pretty key question in all of this is, how do we know when it's over?
Oh, gee, I would love. I'd love to have the answer to that because I'd sell it.
It'd be a bit like Saturday's Lotto numbers, wouldn't it?
Yeah, hang on, let me get my crystal ball out. I think it's going to be over when it's over.
Yeah.
When when will we know it's over? So go back to core practices. So if we think about, I talked about sense making a couple of weeks ago, about identifying what counts as dots in your world, in your organisational world or your personal world. And my ears pricked up when the Prime Minister said, we're going to keep the restrictions in for 4 weeks. So at least now I know that I can't recover for another 4 weeks. I'm going to be in lockdown for another 4 weeks. I look at what's happening every day overseas and I think, well, Singapore's having a second wave. They're going to reintroduce, there's plenty of countries now reintroducing lockdown procedures. I saw something really interesting today, the curves from the Spanish flu in 1918. So there was a small hump, then they released the restrictions and there was a massive big hump and then they released the restrictions. So whether you could draw some parallels there or not, I don't know. But I think that the key to that question is have your plans ready, understand what your timeframes are, do your scenario planning and pay attention to what's happening. And that sense making right throughout the crisis. And I talked about that so what question a couple of weeks ago. So the Prime Minister says 4 weeks. So what does that mean? That means we're locked down for 4 weeks, right? So cool your jets, everybody. Maybe rest some people, get stuff ready that maybe in 4 weeks' time we can start to go back to work or start to resume our new normal. So I think that's the essence of it, Mike. In other disciplines, marine pollution is an interesting one. So they have a document that's called endpoint criteria. So they develop in conjunction with all of their key stakeholders what the end looks like, so that they know as we near the end and we're starting to see some of those key performance criteria met, everybody knows that we're getting towards the end. So it's not a surprise when we turn around and go, you know what, we're finished with our response. We're not going to clean up any more oil. We're handing back to local government, for instance. So maybe creating a bit of a list of what your end looks like is not a bad starting point with that as well, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and certainly in the way that I'm thinking about it in our business and personal circumstances here, there's for me a bit of a sense that might be somewhat staggered. So, there could be an end point to the medical side of things and official government lockdown, and that, they're fairly easily identifiable. But then there might be a more gradual trickle through of, clients coming back online and looking to spend external money and stuff like that. So there's probably a bit of a sliding scale of what endpoints look like depending on the detail of the context that you're looking at. The sense for me is that in a similar way to how it started, for different organisations, there was kind of a different B-day where people woke up and went, "Oh, this is going to be a big deal for our business." Some were well ahead of the game, and others were still coming to grips with it after the impact had happened. And it'll be a bit the same coming out, just more drawn out, probably.
And I think a good example of that will be the difference between, say, New Zealand, Australia, and the US. The US, you've got the governor of Georgia saying, hey, knock yourselves out, go back to work. But that's discounting the states around them that aren't. So you would imagine that kind of disjointed approach to getting back and recovering potentially impacts on the outcome of the recovery. So, in a kind of emergency services world, we say that there's different starting and finishing lines. So when you start recovery, some people start their role and other people finish their role, and it's never a clean line. It is very much kind of a gradual line. And as I said earlier in the piece, people recover differently. So some of your staff will, in organisations, will recover at different times as well. So the expectation that we're recovering now, everybody get back to work. Well, that's folly.
Yeah, I think it's probably similar to the sort of period after there's large scale redundancies in an organisation. There's all sorts of ways that individuals deal with that and systems deal with that, that mean that, it's not just a case of we made those redundancies on that date and started the new normal the date after. There's a little bit of a process to kind of roll it through.
Yeah.
So speaking of new normal, Steve, there's been a few questions around about how do you reimagine normal or create a new normal. There's all sorts of opportunities that potentially present themselves. There's learnings to be had. There's new ways of doing business. Some of those we'll obviously want to hang on to because, we've learned some stuff that's great. Others will be short term that we want to flick off as soon as we can. There'll be old things that we want to reinvigorate and old things that we want to never pick up again. So how do you go about that process of reimagining?
I guess two really big ones that come to mind, Mike, that I've been thinking about for my own self. What are the disadvantages that I've incurred or I imagine? So where am I now disadvantaged as a result of COVID-19? And that might be different clients. I've got one client that looks like they may not survive. So they potentially won't be a client. If they do survive, it'll be a different organisation. So that's one. What are the advantages that I might see or we might see as a result of this? And there'll be some organisations that benefit as a result of this. People say to me, "Oh, you'll be busy as anything at the end of all this," and I don't suspect so, because people that survive will think, "Well, we survived the worst crisis in the last 100 years, so we're great at it." Those that don't survive, well, they won't need my services, right? I don't suspect for me there'll be a great deal of advantage, but maybe some organisations will see in their recovery planning there's opportunities and advantages that arise out of this, and to me that's fair. That's just the way the world goes. So the notion around scenario planning, I think, is really important, and the sports psychologist, she talked about that kind of imagining different scenarios and having that conversation with your teams about what the future might look like in different scenarios is a worthwhile one, but it's risky. So because you don't want to freak people out, right? I certainly think that organisations will probably look at how they've operated in the last month or so, and if we go for another 4 weeks, which we will, that'll be a couple of months, 3 months that we've operated in this kind of work from home mode. And look at that and go, wow, like, do we need to have 1,000 desks in an office in Brisbane, right? Maybe we only need 500, right? And we get some of our staff to work from home, or maybe we only need 500 people. We don't need 1,000 people. So I think that thinking about that and mulling over that and making sense of what's actually happening in the crisis, and reflecting on what does that mean to us as an organisation in a positive and a negative light, I think goes a long way to helping you imagine what your future is like, And you and I were joking earlier about Virgin. I had almost 500,000 points that I've spent on rubbish because I didn't want to lose them, right? And I was going to use those to fly business class when I retired with my wife on holidays. Now we'll have to fly economy. So I guess that's just a simple point about how we have to reimagine what the future looks like, because there'll be changes that we may or may not be in control of.
Absolutely. That's a great conversation, Stephen. There's obviously so many layers to this. A few people have contacted me between the sessions with seeking more detail, and one of the challenges with this particular territory, Stephen and I have been involved in delivering some of these 5 tasks of crisis managers courses here and there, and they can be week-long courses and you're still really only scratching the surface. So there's a lot of complexity in it, Some of the keys from this certainly come down to being able to imagine and hold multiple possibilities, both positive and negative, for your business and your circumstances, and just think through those scenarios. Management of energy will be a key thing as we move into this next phase. And I think from a leadership point of view, a big part of that is around how do we make sure that we're personally refreshed and able to keep our energy levels up. You don't want to grind yourself into the ground and arrive at a point where you can't continue. And the third key thing, and there's been a few comments about this made in the chat boxes and things, is that piece of engaging the broader community in the conversation, whatever the broader community looks like, starts to become really key. And I guess just acknowledging there that different people in those communities will have different appetites and different reasons for wanting to engage those conversations, different priorities, different levels of impact too. So for me, that stuff always comes down to trying to connect as much as possible the broad thrust of whatever recovery efforts are with what's actually important to the individual wherever that's possible, so that they can genuinely get on board with it.
It's interesting. So in a typical kind of emergency, a bushfire or a cyclone or a flood, you would think about recovery in four kind of pillars. You'd think about economic, environmental, infrastructure, and human social. And in this one, the environment's gone, thank God you guys have stopped cars, and you can see fish in the canals in Venice, and dolphins have been seen in the canals at Venice. And so the world has gone, the environment's gone, thank you, COVID-19. Infrastructure really hasn't been affected. If you look at, say, the second airline in Australia, Virgin's an example that potentially could have an impact from an infrastructure perspective, but that won't affect everybody. So when the government thinks about recovery in this context, they have to be thinking about economic and human social. And I really, I was talking to someone today about that actually, about the human social impacts of this. They're intertwined with the economic impacts. And it'll be interesting to see the Commissioner of Rural Fire Service, Shane Fitzgibbon, he's been appointed the recovery coordinator for New South Wales. And it'll be interesting to see, he's a really good thinker and got lots of practice with recovery in bushfire sense. So it'll be interesting to see what he comes out with his recovery plan. But I haven't seen a great deal anywhere about that, but I'm sure they're doing heaps of work on that. And that'll be really complicated, because in my experience, they're the two parts that are super complicated. You can rebuild a road or a bridge, that's easy, and you can do some remediation work about the environment, that takes time, but the human, social and economic piece is critical.
Yeah, for sure. All right, Steve, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much again for your time. Really appreciate you making your expertise available to the community in this kind of way. It's you're the kind of person that, usually, unless you're a fairly large organisation contracting you directly, it's pretty hard, or you're dealing with a crisis, it's pretty hard to get hold of you. So thanks very much for making the time and for sharing your expertise with us.